Independence strategy advisor Sean Hagedorn says the core problem with South Africa is that the country lacks a workable growth model. He says the country's public policies are routinely anti-business, anti-competitive and anti-Western. I spoke to him to explore ways to redesign South Africa's political economy after the local government elections. What has the municipal elections in South Africa revealed so far?
Well, I think we know now a lot more about the tensions among a lot of fundamental factions, and there are a lot of factions at work. And we now know a lot more, particularly about the urban-rural factions, and I think we're learning a lot more about the young-old factions.
Now, what do you really make of what's happening now? Do you think the increase in political competition, as most people try to describe it, judging by the results, will help to boost the momentum for reforms in the country going forward?
Right, absolutely. That's the key question. And I mean, a lot hinges on what happens really just in the next few days, what happens in terms of coalitions. And certainly a lot of analysts, and I would include myself among them, believe that if the DA and the EFF can strike a working modus operandi, so to speak, that then there'll be a lot more pressure for reforms. I don't think that's obvious, but that will create a lot of effective momentum for reforms, but it certainly increases the probability of that happening.
But then there are also those who fear that it might also lead to an increase in populist reforms by the ruling party. Do you also foresee that?
There's been speculation within the capital markets and various opinions among the credit agencies in that regard. And what I've been saying on this show and elsewhere really for more than just a few months is that the numbers just don't work. And so what we're going to see is a lot more scrutiny now, probably of what happens regarding fiscal expenditures and sort of clever tricks to work around the fact that there's just a lot less money to spread around.
But then you see, there are also those who, of course, we have seen mixed reactions from the ratings agencies following that election. While there's still fears of a non-investment grade being given to South Africa by the end of the year, we also saw that the rand started to trend upwards shortly after the elections. What does that say to you? Should we be hoping for the best?
So I have pretty strong opinions about that. I think focusing on the exchange rate and the reaction of the credit agencies and also whether South Africa is going into recession, I think it all misses the point that the credit agencies have spotted ahead of a lot of commentators and observers that the real problem is that South Africa doesn't have a workable growth model. And really in the recent election results haven't really shown any light on how any sort of coalition at any level is going to develop a workable growth model. That's still the huge unknown.
Now, Sean, what workable growth model would you prefer?
Right, I mean, and so that's a really big question, and I do have a lot to say about it. First off, the dialogue has to move in that direction. There's a number of steps. A lot of the choke points are political. Just to list a few things that have to happen, there needs to be an understanding that there's no workable growth model because South Africa doesn't have an economy so much as it has a political economy, and that a lot of the politics are in the way. But then once you get on the other side of the politics, even if there sort of is a working coalition, so to speak, to tackle the problem, there really aren't any viable plans on the table, and there's a lot of misconceptions you have to get through. So there's a lot of steps between where we are now and forging and then implementing a workable growth model. So we're really a long way away. And sorry, if I could just add to that, and a lot of the political focus now is already shifting to 2019. People shouldn't just assume that the polity, that the social cohesion across the country will be relatively stable over a 3-year period when you have such high levels of unemployment, and the reality is that there's really no growth in the economy, and there's not likely to be, and there's going to be increasing stress at the sort of household level, and we really can't anticipate how that might express itself.
Now, Sean, you believe calls for introspection at this time is dangerous for the country. Why?
Well, introspection, so first off, I looked up the word in the dictionary to get a very specific definition, looked at a couple definitions, and it's inner, you're looking inward. And so my big objective in the article was to point out that in the end, there's not going to be a workable growth model unless South Africa decides how it is going to integrate within the world economy. And again, I'm kind of making the point that that discussion hasn't even started. And at every turn, it seems that South Africa just looks more and more inward. And that's the reason we're just so far away from developing a workable growth model.
Now, you're, of course, still looking through that article. You did say, South Africa has been isolated economically and politically for long. And you also cited examples of, from China. Could you just talk us through some of these examples you think South Africa should emulate from China?
Right. Well, so China it's making an aggressive pivot now. But it made a very, very aggressive pivot in the late 70s, and it decided, and China then was extraordinarily poor, and it decided to integrate within the world economy. And at that point, there was still the option of industrialization, and it became the world's leading manufacturing center. And that took a lot of political will. And students of Chinese history are keenly aware that China has over 2,000 years of developing extreme institutional capacity. So China was able to do that very effectively, but it took a very specific decision, a real aggressive pivot to integrate within the world economy. And South Africa now has to make a similar decision, and then it's going to have to follow a different path. And I reference in the article, which I think are a couple pretty good sort of benchmark competitors in terms of the Emirates and India, which are for the most part service-based economies.
Now, Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, you also did push for the need for an increase in skill development in South Africa. According to you, you're saying it's about time we can just move from industrial-led growth and really focus on skills. Practically, maybe, should I put it this way, selling more of your manpower. Is that correct?
Right. I mean, there's no lack of creativity across the country and the region. But there are real impediments, and if you trace them back, you get to political log jams in terms of creating an environment